This is Sudan today, Khartoum to be exact. The way that it looks is pretty unique to itself, but it didn't always look like this. In fact, if we go back to the pre-dynastic eras before Egypt, we can see various similarities, especially these square cows and of course the Nilotic boat. If we compare humble fishing boats today and we compare those fishing boats from back then, you can tell that there's a giant difference. These boats can fit nearly 100 people, and they have these squares which represent the ability to put giant things inside. And you can see these also in Egypt. You always see the square right in the middle, and usually there's like a queen or a king over there. I know if you're a fan of the channel that this does not surprise you, but it should surprise other people to notice that 100% of the boats found in rock carvings in pre dynastic Egypt in Sudan. This is not Nubia in North Africa or Egypt. This is not Nubia close to Egypt. This is in Sudan proper. To find these boats having the exact same images is very interesting. And you see there that we're not talking about one boat or two boats. We're talking about one, two, three, four, five, six that are not being covered by this picture. And then there's more at the bottom and everywhere else. These images show you again that the connection between the South and the North in terms of Sudan was there. And what was connecting them? What is the thing that's connecting them? Well, there's a reason why I'm showing you boats. It's the Nile. They have a shared history of movement and wealth. And why wouldn't they? Why would the Egyptians, over thousands and thousands of years of the invention of the boat, which probably came about as early as it did in Nigeria, or probably it came from the Nigerian one, why would they not move? That's the point of the boat. Interestingly, we can get details of what the boats would have looked like simply by looking at the ones in Egypt with these, I assume, serpents looking at each other. And of course, we can insert other things that they would have put atop of these boxes, like the dog that you see over there, Seth, and so many other things. Or, by the way, that might be no, that's probably Seth because of the tail. I was going to say Basenji, but it's probably not. This should not mislead us. Remember that this was a healthy time for these people. This may look like a desert today, but in real life it was not a desert, and we can easily tell just by looking at other rock art from Sudan. The typical magic that is characteristic of Africa is basically there's rain all the time, and so the land is fertile. And so there is a religion or a custom which you see everywhere, but it sort of went away when it came to the deserts of the Sudan. But we know that they must have existed as well in these parts because their rain dancers are found everywhere in Africa. Rain dancers are basically people who use magical powers and they use their strength as human beings to summon forth the rain. And then when the rain comes, they make sure that the gods are pleased by sacrificing so many items to them. And if we go to Sudan, we find thousands of sacrifices of cattle and stuff like that. By the way, if you live in a desert, sacrificing cattle is dumb. But at the time, because it was green, we're talking about people who had thousands of cattle sacrificed in one occasion. And it's so easy to forget today that this place would have looked nothing like this. It's so characteristic. It almost looks like They are happy to live in a desert with camels built for the occasion, which, by the way, camels did not exist, especially in the building of those pyramids at that time in this region. Instead, what existed was cattle, grass, trees, rivers, all kinds of things. In fact, there's one manufactured river that was made by humans that went through some of these regions, almost stretching the imagination. Trying to imagine greening all around this area is so difficult. It almost looks like this is what the scene should look like, but no, it didn't. At some point, there was green all around. And so, again, let's not let those boats pull us into thinking that the Nile, as I think Herodotus said, or Homer, one of them, said that Egypt is the gift of the Nile, which, to be honest, is true but false at the same time. It's true because obviously the Nile was very important, and every land and city was built around a river, especially a giant river, whether it's the Euphrates, whether it's the Indus, whether it's the Nile, whether it's the Amazonian River. No matter what river it is, cities are built along it. But deep in the, well, let's call them forests of the day, there would have been greening, and these people wouldn't have had a problem in those regions away from the Nile. In fact, I even assume that there are some people who were born and died in Sudan and Egypt who never even saw the Nile because they didn't need to. Local rivers, local small rivers, fed these people. And again, they did not need to travel, they did not need to go anywhere to go find inspiration from the Nile. But the Nile still would be important, as we see in many of the religions of these regions. One of the religions of the people of Sudan is that of the umbilical cord that connects people from heaven down to earth. And it talks about nourishment from the gods who had an umbilical cord from top to bottom. Of course, the story reminds us of some of the early gods in ancient Egypt who were tied between the wind and the air through their arms being raised between the sky and the ground. Eventually, this umbilical cord would be cut, and basically, that now you have a story, and the story is how do you reconnect the gods of the heaven and earth. And this is probably where a lot of these myths would matter. When the sky gods, the rain gods, have abandoned men, they keep praying for rain as they always had, but it just doesn't come. After years and years, it becomes obvious that their magic has dried up and new plans need to come in place. In fact, new people need to come in place, and the old gods are abandoned. The name of the game in life is survival, and these people who lived in Sudan at that time chose survival over customs or staying in ancient places. Now, I'm telling you this because I'm talking about people who came from ancient Egypt who moved into the Bantu regions. Of course, we always say, where is the evidence? Where are the people? Where are the people who moved from north to south, bringing in who they were from Egypt? Well, if we look at the Maasai, we know that they come from the Nilotic regions. We know that they brought new information, they brought new study, and they brought their own culture from those regions. In fact, the Maasai took a lot of culture from the Bantu. It was 1000 BC that they started to move into these regions. And how do we know? Well, we can tell by the rock carvings. The rock carvings that are characteristic to Bantu people do not represent real humans. So much so that deceptive TV shows, they take these people and say that they were aliens. You can see here this spindly form, which just because it's tall, it's not nilotic at all. This is a Bantu drawing in Kenya. And as you saw with the nilotic drawings, but in the Sahara in general, people tend to look like people. These are the swimmers of the Sahara, showing that there was water as well. It's in the North African regions that are far away from the Nile. So we're talking about the Libyan, Tunisian areas, which shows you how watery this place once was. But again, they get to moving. Where to? Well, to Kenya. In Kenya, we have the Luo people. The Luo people, again, probably moved down about 1000 BC. They have customs that are similar but different to those of the people of Kenya. And how do we know? Well, we can look at the religion of the people who live in those regions. And so, if you look at the Kikuyu, they adopted some of these religious systems of the people in North Africa. For example, the umbilical cord story is adopted by the Kikuyu people. The Kikuyu are a Bantu people. But if you look at their neighbors, they did not. They still have the typical animalistic, or not animalistic, animism story, where the people in Africa believe that they came from some connection with nature in that way, whereas in the north, it's some kind of humanoid figure. So, when exploring the Kingdom of Congo and the claim that is made that the Kingdom of Congo was also an offshoot of the ancient Egyptian empire, we must take into consideration the people who came from ancient Egypt and what they had benefited before. Remember, the boats that I showed you in Sudan are typical, very typical of the ones in Egypt. So when I say Egypt, I'm also using Sudan as an example. Of course, they had pyramids and all kinds of stuff. These people moved, or the people of Congo moved into these regions in 500 BC. This would be ample time, at least 500 years, for the people in the Sudanese areas to have influenced them in some way. And so you cannot discount this claim made by a lot of scholars in the Congolese regions that claim that the people of Congo, who, by the way, are still trade partners with the in Anziku, even deep into the Kingdom of Congo. They have direct access to the Nubians as one of their trade partners. Not to mention that, again, we find silks and all kinds of stuff that probably came from the east of Africa moving to the west, and it probably came from Mogadishu, and from Mogadishu moved through the Sudanese regions and then eventually in these areas directly. Now, the people of Congo are lighter skinned than the people of Sudan, so there definitely was more than one influence. The differences between the way the people looked from Congo and the Nilotic regions are obvious. The people from the Nilotic regions tend to have runway model like bodies, very tall. In fact, if you watch a lot of documentaries where white people come and talk to the girls of Congo, they're girls in high school who meet men who are about 6 foot tall and they're taller than them. But if you go to the Congo, the people there are typically, especially the women, very, very, very short. This does not stop them from being related, but there is other influences. three to be exact. So let's say the people in Congo are influenced by three groups: the Niger people, obviously, the Bantu people, obviously, and last but not least, they're influenced by so called pygmies, Khoisan, and other pygmy groups that make them look the way they do. Some people from the Congo or Angola or Rwanda or any of these places, they have a very, very light pigment when you look at them. A lot of people say that is the Khoisan influence, which I would not disagree with. Now, the question is, if the people of Egypt were moving into areas like the Congolese regions, why are there no pyramids in those places? Well, remember, there had been poverty for at least 1,000 years in some regions because of the deserts. And because of those deserts, a lot of culture and customs were lost. And so a lot of the people who are moving, they're survivalists. They're the people who said, I'm not going to live in this desert. And then they moved. And so these people didn't necessarily carry that tradition with them, which is why you see in Sudan, there's pyramids. And you see that there's pyramids as late as 1000 BC. You see there's pyramids later than that. But the people who clearly come from the Sudan and move all the way down to Kenya did not build pyramids in Kenya. They're over that. They're not thinking about that anymore. They're thinking about survival. But the things that they did bring with them are linen. I mean, these people were not wearing skins. It's linen. It's all this other fabric material that is sophisticated. They've got shoes made of certain materials that weren't used prior to them arriving in those areas. And of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff that they bring related to themselves, which we don't need to go into right now. They learn a lot too from the citizens who live in those regions about how to navigate the society itself. In fact, their cultures are so mixed that, of course, you get the Maasai. The Maasai are a easy, easy representation of what happens when Bantu people influence Nilotic people because their customs are so similar to that of the Bantu, but their language is Nilotic. That's the part that's a giveaway. Their language has nothing to do with the Bantu language. Though the people of Sudan are almost ubiquitously Nilotic, they are not. Now, of course, obviously there were Arabs and people like that who moved in and changed the population, but that's not what I'm talking about. There are Bantu people who moved within these regions. You know, it always surprises me when I look at the people of Sudan because their faces, they scream Bantu in terms of their countenance, the way they look. Forget their color and their height. The way they look, they sort of look like Bantu people, just really dark skinned. A simple difference that I easily see between the Nilotic people and the people who live in other places of Africa, no matter where you choose, is a typical rounder face with obviously typical African thick lips, but because of the round face and the tall body with a very small face, it gives off as if they have a baby face. With this elegance, you could probably understand why a lot of these women were carried off from the Sudanese regions into the Egyptian regions and valued very highly. By the way, when I say carried off, I don't mean as slaves. I mean carried off as, well, really spoils of war, and in some cases, just dancers and stuff like that who would move into Egypt to perform and stay there forever. Speaking of Egypt, we've talked about how they moved down to the south in the Bantu regions when it desertified, but actually, people from South Sudan moved north Two, even though the desert was getting hectic, a lot of them moved up and up and up and up from the south. Why would they do this? Well, a lot of them were aware that there's a kingdom right there and that the Nile, again, that's why I said this saying is not completely false, being the gift. Yep. Remember, in Egypt around 750 BC, this is about the time when the Sudanese people, so on one end, you have the Sudanese people moving away from the Egyptian proper areas, moving all the way south to Kenya, and perhaps even lower than that, stopping round about Tanzania, those regions. But at the same time, you have the kingdoms of Nubia, which are based in Napata, which is very low in Sudan, and the Meroitic kingdoms, and they're moving north. They're taking over Egypt. They're moving their brothers into those regions. This shows you that there is at least a dual, perhaps a trio of a migration, but at least there's a dual migration based in Napata and Meroe. You can see they move all the way from there, all the way deep into the Egyptian regions and become kings of those areas. And only when Xerxes comes and kicks them out do you see them moving back and basically staying away from Egypt for a while, constantly raiding and attacking, which of course there's still blemmies or whatever you want to call them. I forgot what the Sudanese call them, but it's a very popular word. I've used it so many times, why can't I remember it? You have the people who are living right by the sea who have horses and they're of Sudanese type, but they have nothing to do with this kingdom, and they're still pushing back against Xerxes and all of those. In fact, Xerxes doesn't go any further than this. He does have Nubians in his kingdom, just not anywhere deep in the south. Now you can easily imagine this, the trouble that befalls the Egyptians and the Nubians, who are drawn typically exactly the same, just the Egyptians have a hat on, or that's like their hair but a little bit carved out. The people of the Sudan who ended up in Egypt would have not had anything to do with the ones in Kenya and Tanzania who were more prosperous or more successful with their neighbors, who weren't as hostile. You can see here Xerxes, typical in Arabic form, the way they look with these giant beards and Arabic bodies, driving out the Egyptian and Nubian armies, which are typical in Sudanese form, in the form of the ancient Egyptians as well. And they're driving them, the woman in the front untied, probably because they're now going to be part of the consort or the women of the kings and the royals. They're going to be part of their harem, to use a word. And these men are probably going to be executed or included in the armies. Actually, they're going to be included in the armies because we know they were included in the armies. There are a lot of Nubians that were included in Xerxes' army. It's the kings that didn't fare very well when they were taken over. There's a reason why they didn't chop off all of their heads. The women who are being driven at the front are telling another story. And this story is the story of mixing between Middle Eastern men and, let's call them Arab, but this is pre Arab people. And the reason why it's important that I show this is because there's this idea that these people never mixed. Well, Xerxes says that he took the wife of the king. He didn't execute her, he took her. if you know what I mean. And then he also took the woman in waiting in the Sudanese regions, and their people did what with them as they pleased, in which some situations they actually married them, showing you how old this fusion would have been. By the way, since he colonized parts of India and other parts of Europe, that's why there's also diversity in that respect. Now, this was not the end for the Nubians and the Sudanese and the Kushites and the Meroetics and all these people, because you still have civilization growing in those regions to the highest extent, mixing and matching with other areas, continuing their Egyptian culture, continuing their Sudanese culture, continuing to defeat people from the Middle East, and continuing to expand further south. This powerful kingdom did not fall when Xerxes came. It instead evolved and kept its Egyptian culture.